This video is brought to you by Wix. It's no secret that we're living in an awesome time for horror. Whether you're most afraid of cult leaders tripping balls, masked men strangling babysitters, leggy aliens killing toddlers, or Allison Williams drinking milk, chances are you've had no trouble getting your scream quota met in recent years. But how did we end up so blessed and so terrified? Horror is largely a reflection of the fears percolating in any given time. But throughout the genre's history, it's been altered and shaped by changes in politics, society, film technology, and the culture at large. To understand how we ended up in this goldmine of modern horror, we're gonna have to take you all the way back to the very first horror films. Welcome to this Wisecrack Edition on why horror changes, and maybe a couple spoilers ahead. But before we get started, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors over at Wix. Everyone's got a passion, hobby, or just something that gets them out of bed in the morning. With Wix, you can take your love to the next level by creating your own website. After years of hosting Wisecrack videos, I've become really interested in voiceover work, and I've decided to take that passion to the next level by creating a website to turn my voiceover career into something legit. I was able to easily create a professional looking site with just a few clicks. Wix offers beautiful pre-designed templates, or you can take a shot at creating your own. The design possibilities are endless. So bring life to the thing you love most by building your own website for free at wix.com/wisecrack or by clicking the link in the description. And now, on with the show. People started experimenting with creepy, crawly images as soon as the first films were being made, usually evoking fairy tales, witchcraft, and ghostly happenings, borrowing heavily from Gothic literature, which was all about spooky monsters and haunted houses. The horror genre, like an industrious succubus, would go on to blossom anywhere there was pain and national chaos. So it's more than fitting that the genre's real boom took place in the mega-depressing post-World War I Germany. During World War I, Germany banned all foreign films, inadvertently throwing all Germanic film nerds a boon. Combine that embargo with the general despair of the era, and you'll see why all the mechanisms were in place for filmmakers to invent German expressionism, a film genre that was all about coping with the economic and social fallout via dreamlike horror films filled with subjective shots, funky angles, high contrast spooky lighting, and frequently sympathetic monsters. Needless to say, the advent of sound inevitably transformed the genre. In 1928, American audiences got the first all-talking horror film, The Terror, about a spook-ridden English country house. Savvily, the plot centered on sound, with much of the ghost's haunting taking place vis-a-vis creepy organ music, creaking doors, and howling winds. It was the birth of a million new conventions, and like most early talkies, it was awkward as hell. Which all brings us to the first earnest boom of American horror film in 1931. First came Dracula, adapted from the classic of Gothic literature that still catered perfectly to an audience reeling from World War I. Dracula was an evil Eastern European nobleman with fangs threatening the upstanding folks of Western civilization. Sound familiar? The revolutionary effect of sound in these films, along with some killer accents,
I am Dracula,
made it an instant smash. The film would be followed by Frankenstein, an even bigger hit that kicked off an assembly line of monster films inspired by Gothic novels. It's not surprising that horror offered the American audiences a welcome outlet for catharsis, because this was the height of the Great Depression. Much like the previous decade's Germany, Americans in the heat of the Depression needed anything to distract them. Throughout horror history, the best artistic choices were often matters of budgetary necessity. Some of the most groundbreaking horror films were those that found cheap ways to effectively generate thrills. In the early 1930s, many long-lasting elements of the horror aesthetic were born and were a product of financial limitations. Spooky shadows required fewer lights, and relatively sparse use of sound kept budgets down.
Master, the sun is gone.
Horror was slaying at the box office, but petered out in 1934, namely because of the full implementation of the Hays Code, the industry's first earnest attempt at censoring salacious content from films. Taking its cue largely from the Catholic Church, the code's main tenet held that no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Imagine defending the moral merits of your favorite horror film to your least fun local pastor, and you'll basically get what filmmakers were going through. Understandably, horror production nosedived in the immediate years after. As World War II descended on the world in 1939, horror returned in full force to, somewhat meekly copy its earlier successes. The 1940s were all about recycling old formulas, with hits like Son of Dracula and House of Frankenstein. Werewolf mania, which began in the late 1930s, solidified with The Wolfman in 1941, which inspired every studio to make its own iteration. Also, historical cliff note, this werewolf boom is inseparable from Hitler, whose first name Adolf literally means wolf and who went by the moniker Herr Wolf when first entering politics. Hitler was often depicted as a wolf in Western propaganda, and werewolf films embody the vicious violence associated with Nazism. From there, producers scrambling for new ideas conceived of monster mashups, aka monster rallies like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, essentially the Suicide Squad of the era. The censor board yielded curious results, allowing some micro-horror genres to flourish unabated. Enter the Mad Scientist saga. These films successfully made it past the censor board because they effectively functioned as anti-science parables, music to the ears of a cranky 40s Catholic Church bureaucrat. Films like Body Snatcher, Dr. Cyclops, and The Ape depicted morally depraved scientists cultivating fun hobbies like shrinking people and stealing people's spinal fluid. In the years after the war, the country was mostly trying to move on, and in the process, the catharsis of horror became less psychologically necessary. As a result, the biggest scary flicks of the era were actually horror comedies like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which became the most successful horror film since the original Frankenstein.
In half an hour, the moon will rise and I'll turn into a wolf.
You and 20 million other guys.
And showed that when it comes to horror tropes, audiences have always been in on the joke. Monsters, it seemed, had lost their cool as American horror mostly left behind the enchanted Gothic castle and ventured into the wild world of science. Most importantly, American horror in the 50s was all about fear of the atom bomb and outer space, and typically merged with sci-fi horror conventions. Iconic monsters include the creature from the Black Lagoon's titular character, a monster created from pollution, as well as the giant irradiated ants seen in 1954's Them.
These creatures are extremely dangerous. They have already killed a number of persons.
Similar themes abounded in The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and Godzilla King of the Monsters. When creatures of doom weren't emerging from the ocean, they were swooping down from the heavens via the Thing from Another World and It Came from Outer Space, reflecting a very timely anxiety caused by increased UFO sightings and the space race against the Soviets. The 1950s were all about teenagers, as the baby boomer generation occupied a prominent social demographic of acne and sarcasm. This social shift collided with the rise of the consumer automobile to create an audience frothing at the mouth for somewhere to park, neck, and watch mediocre movies. Producers appealed to this new audience with an era of prime teeny bopper material like I Was a Teenage Werewolf and Teenagers from Outer Space. Fittingly, this was also the time when the horror genre descended 6 feet under into the B-movie grave. Competition from increasingly sophisticated television programs were hitting Hollywood where it hurt: ticket sales. As 1950s movie producers struggled to lure 10 million American families away from their new television box, they resorted to many marketing and technological gimmicks, which were particularly well suited to the horror genre. These devices included the widescreen cinemascope, immersive stereophonic sound, 3D movies, and smell-o-vision, which is exactly what it sounds like. Movie makers pumped scents into movie theaters to heighten the sensory experience. These goofy gimmicks bring us to the 60s, a mostly non-goofy time for horror. Hitchcock kicked the era off by scaring the pants off of everyone with Psycho, a film that could put you off showering for life. Psycho was based on a novel that was based on very real-life sick fucking serial killer Ed Gein, who captivated the popular imagination as the first diabolically creative serial killer. In many ways, Psycho was another first of modern horror films, in that it featured real victims and villains that the audience could relate to. It based its screams on sadism veiled by everyday niceties, rather than murderous werewolves or killer aliens. 60s horror wasn't all high art scares though. The era also offered audiences some of their first tastes of truly modern gore, like stuff so twisted and sadistic that we can't even show it on this YouTube channel. So when we say gore, you're just gonna have to trust us. 1963's Blood Feast was the first so-called splatter film, a microgenre focused on creative mutilation of the usually female, usually scantily clad human body. Before Blood Feast, you'd see tasteful drops of blood on screen, usually as a way of conveying plot information to the audience, i.e. this guy just got shot. Blood Feast, which followed a serial killing caterer, unleashed a new nightmare of this lady just got her tongue ripped out of her head, or this lady just got scalped while necking on the beach variety. There had been nothing like it before, but quickly there was more of it via follow-up films like 2000 Maniacs and Color Me Red. Which brings us to 1968, a year where everything happened at once. Firstly, the Hays Code was finally dropped. Secondly, this year witnessed the height of the counterculture, as backlash against Vietnam, sexism, and racism fused to destabilize everything society had taken for granted. Fittingly, this year was a watershed for the horror genre, bringing us masterpieces like Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead. For Rosemary's Baby, director Roman Polanski wanted to deliver a classy horror film. Mission accomplished. This film starts out with all the conventions of a romantic comedy or domestic drama, then quickly turns into something else entirely when Rosemary becomes pregnant with the devil's spawn. The film is ultimately about women's subordination to their husband's will and can be seen as a parable about the confines of feminine domesticity, which was under contention with the rise of second-wave feminism. Same goes for Night of the Living Dead, which used zombies to comment on everything from the relentless conformity of consumerism to the violence of the Vietnam War. Night of the Living Dead inspired an explosion of films that embodied the exact countercultural conflicts occurring across America as young people rejected the world their parents had created. Night of the Living Dead also stepped horror film aesthetics into a new era, substituting dark shadows for handheld documentary-style footage that was both amazingly inexpensive and seriously effective. It added a sense of immediacy and realness to the film, particularly resonating as images and footage of the Vietnam War brought very real blood and gore into the lives of all Americans. Critics tend to cite the years of 1968 through 1984 as the golden age of horror cinema, and indeed, the 70s brought it hard, as newly relaxed censorship laws met the booming creativity of New Hollywood. Horror films reflected and reacted to the drastic cultural changes at the time. Each and every anxiety, from birth control to gas shortages, was reflected in horror films. Importantly, as the Vietnam War lingered on, filmmakers openly grappled with the horrific violence via movies like Death Dream and Last House on the Left. Then there were moral crises to contend with, i.e. the sexual revolution, the pill, and its effect on the American family. As a result, nice families, and particularly their prepubescent daughters, were constantly under threat in horror films, often from satanic forces, best seen in the iconic 1973 film The Exorcist, which famously follows the satanic decline of normal tween Reagan as she becomes possessed, curses creatively, and throws up soup. Some scholars see The Exorcist and other devil-infused films of its era as a manifestation of baby boomers' crisis of faith as they began to question organized religion. Meanwhile, Mutant Babies, interpreted as a reference to fears that birth control caused birth defects, manifested in It's Alive and It Lives Again. Race also came into play with the rise of blaxploitation horror, which reconceived classic white monsters as black characters. Take Blackula, which turned the famed vampire into an African prince. These films used classic horror elements to explore real race issues, as seen when Blackula faces off against very white policemen. Films followed like Abby, a parody of The Exorcist,
Hear me, demon! Leave this woman's body!
Sugar Hill, a black zombie flick, and Ganja and Hess, an artsy vampire movie about imperialism. All these films showed an America grappling with the changing gender and racial norms and the aftermath of the 60s social movements. The 70s also witnessed the destruction of old tropes. Texas Chainsaw Massacre took a literal chainsaw to typical horror film structure, filling the whole reel with pure terror and providing the template of the clueless teens that would be exploited to great effect in the 80s.
Anybody home? Hello?
It also witnessed the birth of hillbilly horror, which fantasized about a terrifying dark underbelly of small-town America. Even in this creepy serial killer film though, the disintegrating family is on display, literally as we learn when we meet Leatherface's quirky family unit. Families continued to falter into 1978, which brought John Carpenter's classic Halloween, starring American babysitters being murdered by Michael the Madman. He would become the model for the new horror film villain, lacking reason, emotion, and it seemed the ability to just freaking die. Again though, the film's trauma was all about the family. Scholar Pat Gill explains that the babysitters in Halloween think of their jobs as opportunities to share drinks and beds with their boyfriends. One by one, they're killed by Michael Myers, who years ago at the age of 6, murdered his sister for preferring sex to taking care of him. That's a lot to unpack in therapy.
Totally.
If the 70s was about establishing a uniquely American brand of horror, it was bookended perfectly by Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film, The Shining, a film that deals with the American family unit as the site of horror, while exploring social issues ranging from domestic violence to colonization.
The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
The early 1980s brought a lot of slasher films, bloodier than ever before, and a lot of it mediocre. These films had a familiar formula: hot teenagers in isolated locations being targeted by psycho killers. The carefree teens would be engaged in recreational drug use or premarital sex, only to be killed by the slasher for failing to just say no. These stories functioned as moralistic warnings, offering graphic, gory consequences for sinners, while simultaneously allowing semi-repressed audiences to voyeuristically partake in said sins. Nicknamed dead teenager films, these films proliferated in the form of Friday the 13th Part 2, Happy Birthday to Me, My Bloody Valentine, etc., and are an apt reflection of 1980s tough-on-crime conservatism. The 80s were all about excess, specifically body horror with piled-on special effects. We saw blood and gore like never before, culminating in films like Bride of Reanimator and From Beyond. Body horror met social issues with the terrifying rise of the AIDS virus. With the plight of its victims ignored by mainstream America, horror became an outlet for exploring fears surrounding the virus. This was echoed in John Carpenter's 1982 film The Thing, in which a blood test was used to determine whether somebody was a scary thing, or his 1987 film Prince of Darkness, in which evil is literally exchanged through fluid. Or in David Cronenberg's The Fly, which showed a scientist with a degenerative condition that slowly ate away at him. Similar to the way that rom-coms have faltered in recent years, the 1990s was the least golden era for horror films. Fitting our thesis that horror dominates in periods of fear and uncertainty, we see the inverse here. Clinton-era prosperity meant fewer real-life nightmares. There are exceptions, of course. Serial killers took over horror cinema, with more than 150 films made about serial killers and/or the forensics teams rushing to hunt them down. This era was ushered in by 1991's Silence of the Lambs, the only horror film to ever dominate the Oscars, thanks in large part to the terrifying performance of Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter, an elegant psychiatrist/bloodthirsty cannibal who defined a new era of horror villains, cold-hearted sadists.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
The 90s were also a self-referential time in movies, an era that would be dubbed, to the delight of many a pretentious film major, postmodernism. Fittingly, the self-referential Scream and Scary Movie, which followed in 2000, were some of the only horror films to break through the noise in this era, precisely because they commented on the incessant tropes of the genre. They were proof that audiences were sophisticated enough to see that they were being fed the same old junk over and over again. But 1999 foretold of a new era of horror on the horizon. First came The Blair Witch Project, a found footage marketing masterpiece made on a crazy low budget that knocked the socks off of film critics and audiences alike, thanks in part to the crazy mythos that the footage came from the real experience of some college film nerds. This found footage element was reflective of technological changes, namely the rise of smaller digital cameras, which allowed for cheaper and more mobile filmmaking. But it also reflected the growing unease in a world that was increasingly taking place on camera, a theme that would be explored in the next decade's found footage films. Another breakthrough moment for horror in the year 1999 came, of course, with The Sixth Sense.
I see dead people.
This film arguably introduced the horror film that essentially functioned as a terrifying drama, a style that current-day horror producer Jason Blum has perfected with flicks like Get Out and The Gift. While a lot of horror filmmakers dismiss any connections, there's a pretty clear correlation between the rise of a new era of horror and the horrors of 9/11. Following the terror attack, a new era of zombie films rose to prominence, with over 300 zombie movies coming out that decade. Why zombies in this era? Well, zombies delve into anxieties fitting to a post-9/11 world, from biological terrorism to government breakdown, all relevant for a shell-shocked nation coming to grips with what had happened. By mid-decade, we were immersed in a new genre of horror known as torture porn, which typically takes sympathetic characters and treats them like piñatas, as depicted through graphic close-ups. Many film scholars have seen torture porn as a natural offshoot of the country's increased fear of terrorism, as well as its complicated mixed reaction to the United States' enhanced interrogation, or torture, and increased government surveillance. Franchises like Hostel and Saw took off, along with new films like The Devil's Rejects and highly violent sequels like Freddy vs. Jason, House of a Thousand Corpses, and a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre. As scholar Isabel Pinedo puts it, these films reflect a United States primed for fear and an escalated threat to the body. It's perhaps no coincidence that the genre took off in 2004, as if in tandem with the April release of images of heinous abuse taking place in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. The following year's Hostel had a scene in which one victim is stripped, hooded, and bound, directly invoking the horrific images. Now, critics were and remain quick to get on their high horse about the torture porn craze. However, there's reason to think that human beings have always appreciated a bit of morally inspired human rights abuses in their cultural consumption. Film critic Ann Bilson compares the films of Saw to the religious paintings of Hieronymus Bosch and Peter Bruegel the Elder, which depict intricate retributive justice taking place in colorful renditions of hell, suggesting that no matter the medium, humans have always liked watching morally compromised members of our species suffer in magnificently gruesome ways. But boy did they enjoy it in the mid-2000s, from Turistas to Captivity to Wolf Creek. Which brings us to the present day. As we said before, the genre always flourishes during eras of crisis and national trauma. Perhaps fitting for a time in which the general sentiment is that the world is a heaping pile of garbage fire with little to no hope of changing. In this era of streaming and binge watching, horror films have become among the most reliable profit drivers for studios, with hits ranging from the critically acclaimed It to the less critically acclaimed The Nun. In the process, they've become more mature since the 1950s, when horror was largely seen as best suited to young children or teens. Lately, horror has been catering to a generation of adults living in great financial and social instability, as if predicting that the Great Recession generation will have plenty of unknown to scream at as they face down the barrel of stagnating wages, student loan debts, and shitty healthcare. As in the 1970s heyday of the genre, horror films are a family affair, with the unspoken tensions and animosities felt between family members constituting the biggest spook factors. Take The Babadook, which explores the horrors of motherhood, or Hereditary, which explores the horrors of motherhood, or Goodnight Mommy, which explores the horrors of motherhood. Seeing a pattern here? Some of this is a function of the film industry becoming slightly less dominated by men. Female-helmed horror films have been addressing the female experience in interesting ways that harken back to the inventiveness of Rosemary's Baby. Take the Belgian-French film Raw, which uses themes of cannibalism to deal with female sexuality, or the Persian-language American vampire film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which confronts both Iranian and American brands of misogyny. Horror today is also becoming increasingly explicit about the very real connection between on-screen horror and real-life pain, as many horror films reflect on social issues. This was demonstrated clearly with Jordan Peele's Get Out, which depicted a black man appropriately frightened by a brain-swapping white family. The Purge series is similarly fixated on American social issues, with the most recent iteration, The First Purge, directly addressing America's history of scientific experimentation on people of color. Films like The Purge, as well as the TV series American Horror Stories Cult Season, reflect an increasingly divided America.
Without
you, world!
Entrepreneur.
The films of today are also preoccupied with the end of the world, reflecting growing anxieties about, well, the end of the world. From A Quiet Place to Bird Box to It Comes at Night, we're seeing many spooky imaginings of a less than pretty future. These films reflect aspects of the creature horror of the 50s and 70s, but place them in an even bleaker setting. We're seeing films that intelligently reflect the audience's working knowledge of horror tropes, like Cabin in the Woods or It Follows. Rather than simply embracing the satire of it like Scary Movie though, these films take these tropes seriously and debatedly deliver real scares. So what do you think of horror's trajectory? Are you longing for the days of Frankensteinian simplicity or nostalgic for 1980s body horror? And what do you think the 2020s will bring for a genre that is in a constant state of creation, destruction, and reinvention? Let us know in the comments, and if you'd like to build your own website with Wix, click the link in the description. And as always, peace.